My wife inherited her late father's estate and kicked me out with 3 garbage bags. She called me a stray and threw away our 6-year marriage. She had no idea her dad left a secret 90-day decency clause in his $33M will. The moment the lawyer opened his private journal, her face turned bone white. My name is Kyle. I'm 34, a construction manager, and I had been married to Vanessa for 6 years. Her father, Walter Hargrove, had died 11 days earlier. He'd left behind a $33 million estate, real estate holdings, investment accounts, liquid assets built across 4 decades. Vanessa was his only child. The morning after the will was read, I was standing on a public sidewalk holding everything that was supposedly mine. But here's what Vanessa didn't know. Walter had left one more document. Nobody in that room had read it yet. To understand how we got here, I need to back up a little. Not much, just enough to give you the right picture. I married Vanessa when I was 28. She was charming and confident and easy to be around when she wanted to be. Her family had money, not the kind that made her work for anything, but the kind that made her expect things. I didn't mind it at first. I told myself people grew into responsibility when life asked it of them. It was a generous interpretation. I was wrong. Within 2 years, certain things were obvious. Vanessa hadn't held a full-time job since a 4-month stint at a boutique. She'd quit because the manager, in her words, had an attitude. She wasn't looking for another position after that. My paycheck funded the household. I covered 90% of our monthly expenses on a construction manager's salary, $87,000 a year. Every promotion I made, from site worker to crew lead to where I was, she treated like something happening in another room. One evening, at a dinner with her friends, she referred to my job as the construction thing. She laughed. After she said it, the way you laugh at something that's both obvious and slightly embarrassing. I remember sitting there and not saying anything back. Walter never said a critical word about his daughter to me. Not once. But I learned, much later, that he watched everything. Walter was self-made. He'd started with one piece of commercial property in his early 30s and built it into something real over 40 years of disciplined work. He had a straightforward way of measuring people, not by what they said about themselves, but by what he saw them do when no one was grading them. He drove 45 minutes to walk a job site with me once, a 12-unit residential project I was managing at the time. He didn't offer a lot of commentary. He just watched how I moved through the crew, how I answered questions, how I handled a subcontractor who showed up 2 hours late. At the end, he clapped me once on the shoulder and said, "A man who shows up is worth more than 100 who just show up on paper." I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it all the time now. About 18 months before he passed, Walter was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. That was the point where you find out who someone actually is. I drove him to 67 appointments, chemo sessions, follow-ups, imaging, the WDAC consultations where the doctor was cautious with language, and the ones where he wasn't. I organized Walter's medications in those plastic weekly containers because he kept confusing the Tuesday pills with the Thursday ones. I sat with him in waiting rooms that smelled like recycled air and dull fluorescent light. And most of the time, we talked about very little because that was easier than talking about the obvious thing, which was that he was running out of time. In 6 months, Vanessa visited twice. Both times she brought her friend Brittany. Both times she stayed less than 2 hours and found a reason to leave early. In his last month, Walter asked me to stay the night. He said he didn't want to be alone in the house. Vanessa didn't come. In those final months, I noticed something had changed in the way Walter asked questions. Less conversation, more direct lines. He'd look at me across the table and say, "Does she thank you for this? Does she know what you carry?" I always found a way to redirect. I didn't want to talk about my marriage to a man who was dying, and I figured he was just an old man with a lot weighing on him. So I'd change the subject, and he'd let me, and we'd talk about something else. What I didn't know was that after I left, he was writing it all down. About 2 weeks before Walter died, his longtime attorney, a man named Philip Brennan, who'd represented Walter's estate for 22 years, made a private visit to the house. He brought 2 licensed physicians with him. I wasn't informed about the visit. I found out later that a formal evaluation of Walter's Mental clarity was completed that same week, witnessed and documented. At the ration time, I assumed it was routine end-of-life paperwork. I had no idea what Walter had asked Philip to prepare or what he'd been writing about for the past 8 months. Walter passed on a Tuesday morning, just before 8 o'clock. Patricia, the hospice nurse who'd been with him in his final weeks, called to tell me I was already managing a site. I drove 38 minutes. When I got there, Vanessa was on the phone. I caught the word assets before she stepped into another room. That evening, she told me the will reading was a family matter and I wasn't needed. I asked if I wasn't family. She paused, the way someone pauses when they've already moved on from a question and just wanted a moment to select the answer. Then she said, "You'll be fine, Kyle." She locked the bedroom door that night. I slept on the couch. The reading was the next morning, held privately, just Vanessa, Jennifer, and Philip. I wasn't invited. I waited at the house. Vanessa came back around noon. By 4 o'clock, I was standing on the sidewalk. She had pre-packed those bags. That's the detail that took me the longest to process. Brittany was already in the living room when Vanessa called me in and told me it was time to go. Brittany, who had spent approximately 0 hours at any of Walter's appointments, who had laughed at Vanessa's jokes about my line of work, who was now standing in my living room while my possessions were handed to me in yard waste bags. Vanessa said, "I think this is better for both of us." I asked about our marriage, what we were doing, what the plan was. She said, "Kyle, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Brittany smiled at me from the doorway. I picked up the bags and kept walking. I checked into a motel on Route 9. $74 a night, shared parking, a lot with a trucking company. I had my laptop, my work ID, and what was inside. Those 3 bags. I called my foreman and told him I'd be on site the next morning at 6:30. Then I sat on the edge of the motel bed and went through each bag methodically. Clothes, chargers, bathroom items, my personal savings. At the time came to about $2,200. What struck me, sitting there, was how deliberate the packing had been. Not careless, not rushed in anger, deliberate. Someone had thought about what to include and what to leave out. The bags had everything that was easy to explain and away as mine, and nothing that complicated a story. No work documents. No shared financial records I'd filed. No personal items that required any discussion. It was a very clean edit of 6 years. What wasn't in the bags was my grandfather's watch, a 1967 Omega Seamaster, that had been sitting on the bedroom dresser for 6 years. I figured she'd just missed it. I'd call tomorrow. 3 days after the eviction, a coworker sent me a screenshot. Vanessa had posted on social media photos of the house, a renovation crew already in the kitchen, caption reading, "New chapter." I called her about the watch. "Oh, I think I donated that," she said. "I was doing a big declutter." "That was my grandfather's watch, Vanessa." "Kyle, it's just a watch. You're being dramatic." I asked whether she had filed anything with a lawyer, what the legal process was going to look like. She said she had someone handling it. She used the word manageable, the way you describe a minor scheduling conflict, not the end of a 6-year marriage. She got off the call quickly. By Thursday, a coworker who still lived near the house told me the bedroom walls were already down. On day 5, Brittany called me. She positioned herself as someone trying to help. "Vanessa cared about me," she said, "but this was Vanessa's time, and I needed to respect that." Then she said, "You got 6 years of the Hargrove lifestyle, Kyle. That's not nothing." I listened to all of it without interrupting. I said, "Okay, thanks, Brittany." Then I hung up, opened the Common Notes app on my phone, and typed down every word she'd just said. Exact phrasing. I didn't fully understand why I was doing it. I just did it. About 2 weeks after the eviction, I drove past the house. No legal reason not to. We hadn't filed anything. The property was still technically marital. There was a new nameplate on the mailbox. Hargrove. Just that one word, like. The 6 years I'd lived there had been quietly erased overnight. The renovation was already complete. I called Vanessa about recovering more of my belongings. She said a lawyer would be handling all future contact and I needed to stop showing up. I had been on a public road, 40 feet from the property. I didn't raise my voice. 3 days later, a letter arrived from her attorney. It stated that I was a source of emotional distress and that all communication must go through legal representation. I read that phrase twice. Then I set the letter down on the motel table and looked at the parking lot for a while. On day 19, my phone rang. Patricia. She said she'd been thinking about me since the funeral and wanted to check in. I appreciated that. Patricia was a practical woman, not the kind to call out of habit. When she said she'd been thinking about me, she meant it literally. She told me Walter had spoken about me constantly in his final weeks. Not as a son-in-law, as a son. She said he used that word specifically more than once, and that she had found it notable enough to remember. She also said Walter had asked her, in the last weeks, to write down certain things she had witnessed during her time in the house. He hadn't explained fully why, just said that it might matter later, and that he trusted her to be accurate. She'd done it carefully, she said. 4 pages, handwritten, she still had them. She wasn't certain what they were for, but she thought I should know. They existed. Then she said, I think you should call Philip Brennan. 2 days after that, Jennifer texted me. She kept it brief and careful. Vanessa had been telling people I couldn't handle Walter's death and had needed to leave. She'd positioned herself as the bereaved daughter, managing a difficult situation and a fragile husband. Jennifer also said there was a version of the story circulating in Vanessa's circle, sourced from Vanessa, that I had married into the family for financial reasons. Jennifer said she didn't believe it. She also said at least 4 people she knew had heard this version. I didn't respond to Jennifer. I opened the Notes app again. She was rewriting 6 years of my life, and most people were going to believe her because she was the one still in the house. I called Philip Brennan the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. The first thing he said was, I've been expecting your call. I'm surprised it took this long. I drove to his office that afternoon. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, one hard leather chair across from the desk, a window that faced a blank wall. Philip was 61, with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of delivering consequential information to people who weren't ready for it. He set a folder on the desk between us. The tab read, Hargrove Estate Conditional Provisions. He slid a single document across to me and said, Read paragraph 4. I read it. Then I read it again. The folder was labeled conditional. I didn't know yet what that word was going to cost Vanessa. Philip explained it plainly. Walter's estate, the full $33 million. Every property, every account, every dollar of liquid assets, transferred to Vanessa under a specific condition. She was required to maintain what the document called a demonstrable standard of decency and respect toward Kyle Mercer for a period of no less than 90 days from the date of the wills. Reading. Failure to meet that standard, as evaluated by Philip Brennan using documented evidence, would trigger a full transfer of the estate to Kyle Mercer. Instead, the clause had been drafted and signed by Walter, witnessed by 2 licensed physicians, notarized, and confirmed in writing by a sitting judge, all completed 14 days before Walter's death. While he was documented to be in full mental clarity, Philip looked up. She had 11 days, he said. She used none of them correctly. He opened a second folder. Walter's journal, 8 months of daily entries in his own handwriting. Specific dates, specific incidents, exact language. Philippe. Read 2 of them aloud. January 14th. Vanessa called Kyle's job embarrassing in front of her friends at dinner. Kyle said nothing. He cleaned the kitchen after they left. March 3rd. Vanessa did not answer Kyle's call for 4 hours during a site emergency. She was at a spa. Kyle resolved the situation on his own and did not mention it when she came home. There were 22 entries in total. Philip had cross-referenced each one. With Patricia's written statement, 4 pages of careful, handwritten testimony from the woman who had been present in that house through Walter's final months. The 2 documents aligned on 14 specific dates. 2 witnesses, 2 independent records, 1 consistent picture. Then Philip opened a third folder. Call records. Our state has single-party consent laws, which meant any call I was part of could be legally recorded by either participant. Vanessa had called me multiple times after the eviction. Philip had transcripts from several of those calls. He found the one from day 4 still inside the 90-day evaluation window and read one excerpt. Vanessa's voice, on the record, Timestamped. You were lucky I kept you around. As long as I did. Walter always liked strays. Philip set the transcript down. He didn't add anything to it. That's more than enough, Kyle, he said. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. What happens to Vanessa if I submit the evidence package? Philip didn't soften the answer. She loses the inheritance. All of it. He also explained what happened if I did nothing. The 90-day window was at day 22. I had 68 days left. If I didn't formally submit evidence package for Philip's evaluation, the conditional clause would default. Vanessa would retain everything. No legal claim on the property. No recognition of 6 years of contribution. No recourse of any kind. I would walk away with 3 garbage bags, a stack of motel receipts, and $2,200. Meanwhile, Vanessa had already spent estate funds on legal counsel and renovations. She was actively building a public record in which I was the unstable one, the one who couldn't handle grief, the one who had never really belonged. Every day I waited, that version of the story got a little more established. The window closed whether I moved or not. That was the part Philip said slowly, the way he said things he wanted to make sure landed. The clock was running. Either way. The only variable was what I did with the time I had left. I didn't say anything right away. I thought about 67 drives. The early ones in the dark, Walter in the passenger seat, not saying much. The later ones, when he was weaker and sometimes fell asleep before we got to the clinic. I thought about 3 black garbage bags on a sidewalk. My grandfather's watch, sitting in a donation bin somewhere because it was just a watch. A legal letter, calling me a source of emotional distress. A nameplate on a mailbox with my name erased from it. And I thought about what Philip had read me from entry 19 of Walter's journal, the line that had been sitting in the back of my head since he said it out loud. Kyle is the best decision my daughter ever made. She doesn't know it yet. I thought about those 67 drives. I thought about those 3 garbage bags. And then I said 2 words. Submit it. Philip nodded. He said, your father-in-law would be proud. He submitted the full evidence package 72 hours later. 3 weeks after that, Philip called a formal estate evaluation meeting. The attendees. Vanessa, her attorney David retained 3 weeks prior, his fees, drawn from Walter's estate account, her cousin Jennifer, and me. Vanessa arrived in a new coat. I noticed the tags were still folded inside the new ace collar, the way they are when something hasn't been worn before. She walked in, and her eyes went straight to me. Something shifted in her face, not quite. Surprise, more like calculation interrupted. She leaned toward David and said, low enough that she thought only he could hear, why is he here? Philip said, because this concerns him. Vanessa settled into her seat. I could see her composing something. She looked at me the way she'd looked at furniture she'd already decided to replace, not with hostility, just with the certainty that it had already been dealt with. I let her look. Philip opened without any preamble. He read the conditional clause aloud in its entirety, the standard of decency and respect, the 90-day evaluation window, the transfer mechanism. Every person in the room went very still. David started to object about halfway through the reading. Philip raised one hand, didn't look up, and kept reading. He set the document down. Vanessa said, that's not legal. Philip's voice didn't change. It was notarized, witnessed by 2 licensed physicians, and confirmed in writing by a sitting judge prior to your father's death. It is entirely legal. Vanessa looked at David. David was studying the table. David made an argument about the language that decency and respect was too subjective, a standard to be enforceable, that the clause was open to interpretation. Vanessa cut across him before he finished. I was grieving, she said. Whatever happened in those first weeks, it came from grief. It wasn't who I am. Kyle knows I didn't mean any of it. She looked at me when she said that last part, like we had an understanding, like this was still something I could absorb quietly and let go. I said nothing. Philip opened the evidence folder. He read one line from January 14th. Then he found the call transcript from day 4 and read the excerpt. Vanessa's own words, legally obtained, clearly time-stamped, sitting well inside the 90-day window. Walter always liked strays. Jennifer closed her eyes. Philip set the transcript down. He said, Mrs. Hargrove, Mercer, your father anticipated this argument. He left a personal note as a formal addendum to the estate file. He paused. Would you like me to read it? Vanessa's voice went flat. Don't read that. Philip read it anyway. Vanessa, if you are hearing this, you made the choice I feared you would. I love you. I always will. But Kyle showed up when you did not. He drove me to every appointment, sat with me through the nights you didn't come, and never once asked for recognition. He deserved better from you. The estate goes to him, not as punishment, but as recognition. He is the family member who acted like one. Philip read those 4 sentences. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Vanessa didn't speak. I didn't move. Jennifer had both hands pressed over her mouth, eyes down. David gathered his papers without making eye contact with anyone. Walter had written those words himself, in his own hand, as a formal addendum to a legal document he'd spent 8 months constructing. And every word was about me. 3 weeks after the meeting, the estate transferred to me. $33 million properties, accounts, liquid assets. The house, the one I'd renovated with my own hands. The one renamed Hargrove on the mailbox. The one I was told belonged to someone else's family now was legally mine. I didn't move back in. I listed it within 60 days of the transfer. The thing I did with the proceeds was clear. 3 months of unpaid overtime for crew members on a stalled project. The second thing was set aside a fund for Patricia. I didn't keep track of Vanessa's life after that. 6 months later, Jennifer texted me. She kept it short, just that Vanessa was working a customer service job at a mall in the same county where Walter's estate had been. Jennifer's tone was careful, like she wasn't entirely sure why she was telling me. We thought about something Walter had said on one of those long, quiet drives back from the clinic. Some people have to earn the lesson the hard way. I didn't. Right back to Jennifer. There was nothing left to say. I kept one of the 3 garbage bags in the bed of my truck for a long time. I'm still not entirely sure why. Maybe throwing it away felt like closing something before I understood what it meant. On the day the estate transfer was finalized, I took it out of the truck bed and dropped it in a dumpster in the Tymont parking lot outside Philip's office building. Just set it in and walked back to Marius, the truck, without looking at it again. Walter didn't leave me money. He left me proof that showing up matters. He spent 8 months documenting it, made sure it was witnessed and signed and airtight, and then he trusted the process he'd built to do exactly what it was designed to do. Those 3 garbage bags were Vanessa's way of saying I was disposable. Walter made sure they were the last thing she ever threw away.